King John of England died in the middle of a brutal dysenteric collapse, losing control of his body while his kingdom fractured around him, and medieval chroniclers describe his final hours with unsettling clarity. They wrote of relentless diarrhea, rising fever, and total intestinal failure striking him at the exact moment French forces occupied London, Scottish armies pushed from the north, and his own barons turned against him. The king, who had already lost Normandy, lost the trust of his nobles, and been forced into the humiliation of Magna Carta, spent his last days emptied by disease faster than he could hold his dying realm together, collapsing at Newark Castle in October 1216. John of England began his life as a prince who was never meant to rule, and that simple fact followed him into every stage of his reign. He was born the youngest son of King Henry II, at the bottom of a powerful dynasty where his older brothers inherited the great lands, the military commands, and the reputation that shaped Europe. John received none of it. He grew up watching others take the roles he wanted, and this early imbalance turned him into a man who clung to authority with sharpness rather than confidence. When he finally reached the throne in 1199, it was not because he had earned it through victories or loyalty, but because everyone else had died before him. England gained a king already tense, already defensive, already terrified of losing what he had only just gained. From the start of his reign, John ruled the way insecure men rule, through force, pressure, and punishment. He taxed heavily, fined nobles for the smallest offenses, seized hostages to guarantee loyalty, and treated political disagreement as a personal insult. This approach created a kingdom filled with resentment. The barons feared him but did not respect him, and the more resistance he sensed, the harder he squeezed. But beneath these political tensions something else was happening, something that would grow into the defining disaster of his life. John's stomach began failing early, long before anyone connected those episodes to the fatal dysentery that would later destroy him. The first signs were humiliating enough to unsettle even his closest attendants. During councils he would suddenly freeze, clutch his abdomen, and leave the room with a strained, urgent expression. On good days he managed to find privacy and time. On bad days he didn't, and servants had to assist him afterward, quietly removing soiled garments and replacing them before anyone outside the chamber understood what had occurred. These early failures were small in number but severe in impact, because they revealed a body that could no longer guarantee stability even during routine acts of government. As months passed, the episodes became more frequent and increasingly uncontrollable. Any surge of stress, a lost castle, a baron changing sides, a demand from the church, triggered an immediate intestinal reaction that forced the king out of the hall mid-sentence. At feasts he vanished so abruptly that musicians faltered. Servants who dealt with the aftermath noticed that his bedding often needed to be replaced overnight, a clear sign that his intestines were emptying without his awareness while he slept. These nighttime accidents left him so weak in the mornings that he sometimes struggled to stand long enough to dress. Travel turned the problem into a crisis. Riding over rough English roads created sudden shocks that brought on violent intestinal surges he could not prevent. There were days when the king had to halt repeatedly, not for military reasons, but because his body failed again and again in rapid succession. His attendants traveled with water, cloths, and spare clothing out of necessity, because the king's condition required constant management. Even the smell around his traveling camp became difficult to suppress despite every effort to maintain royal dignity. By the time John clashed with the church, the illness had progressed to the point where concealment was no longer possible. He frequently woke to find that another uncontrolled evacuation had occurred during the night, leaving him exhausted and disoriented. The chamber pot beside his bed filled faster than attendants could empty it. Some mornings he could barely rise because the dehydration and fever brought on by the continuous intestinal losses drained him of strength before the day had even begun. Servants entered his chambers with cloths pressed discreetly to their faces, not to offend him, but because the persistent odor of sickness made the air heavy. His temper grew erratic because the illness struck without warning. During formal audiences he shifted suddenly in his seat or gripped the armrest as a new cramp tore through him. More than once he attempted to end a session but hesitated, knowing that moving would reveal another uncontrolled episode to the entire court. When he finally returned wearing fresh garments, Barons avoided meeting his gaze, fully aware of what his attendants had just done behind the side curtain. By the time rebellion erupted and the Magna Carta negotiations began, John was already a king fighting a losing battle against his own body. Each day brought fresh humiliations, bedding that had to be stripped, clothing that needed constant replacement, interruptions so frequent he could not finish a briefing without stepping away, and a chronic odor that clung to him no matter how hard his attendants worked to contain it. His intestines were failing long before the final fatal infection struck. The kingdom was breaking, and so was the man, exhausted, overwhelmed, unable to maintain control, and watching his authority collapse at the same pace as his body. As the kingdom shifted into open rebellion, John's illness advanced with a speed that startled even the men who served him closely. What began as episodic weakness turned into a continuous breakdown of his intestinal system, marked by sudden evacuations he could neither anticipate nor control. These episodes struck several times a day, sometimes in the middle of councils, sometimes during military discussions, sometimes while he was on the move. Each one left him drained to the point of trembling, and each one interrupted the work of a king who needed every moment of clarity to hold a collapsing realm together. During the early campaigning he attempted to hide the extent of the problem, but the demands of war made that impossible. Long rides over uneven ground triggered violent intestinal reactions, and the king was repeatedly forced to stop because the illness emptied his body faster than he could respond. His attendants began carrying replacement garments and linens, not out of precaution but because the king could no longer guarantee even brief periods of control. By midday his clothing often needed to be changed more than once, and the odor that clung to him made secrecy unrealistic. Men around him understood that he was suffering from a condition that prevented him from maintaining even basic stability. Siege operations exposed the severity of his decline even further. While commanders discussed strategy, John frequently had to withdraw abruptly because a surge of intestinal pain signaled another uncontrollable evacuation. The physical weakness that followed was unmistakable. He returned pale, shaking, and visibly diminished. His legs sometimes failed to hold him steady, and officers noted that he struggled to remain upright long enough to finish issuing orders. The gradual loss of strength made his authority appear fragile at exactly the moment he needed it to be unbreakable. Food offered no relief. Even small amounts passed through him almost immediately, forcing him into repeated evacuations that stripped him of water and salts faster than attendants could restore them. Dehydration soon became one of the most dangerous parts of his decline. His hands shook constantly. His voice weakened. His thoughts fractured under fever. More than once he tried to outline troop movements only to lose the thread entirely, staring at the map with a vacant expression as the illness pulled his focus away. His ability to concentrate for more than a few minutes deteriorated sharply. As the French pushed deeper into the realm and more barons defected, John's attendants abandoned the idea of concealment. Chamber pots were moved near his working areas because he could not count on making it across a tent in time. But even these measures were often too slow. He experienced sudden episodes before he could sit or steady himself, and his bedding and clothes had to be replaced repeatedly throughout the day. The smell of sickness permeated his encampments despite all efforts to mask it, and it silently told every man present that the king's body was failing faster than his armies could maneuver. Nights became just as difficult. John often woke disoriented in bed, having suffered another uncontrolled evacuation in his sleep. His attendants cleaned him, replaced the sheets, and tried to bring him water, only for the same cycle to repeat hours later. These nighttime losses, combined with constant dehydration, left him unable to stand without assistance. His skin grew hot with fever, yet he shivered uncontrollably from exhaustion. The men who cared for him began to treat his illness not as a temporary affliction but as a permanent condition dominating every waking hour. And still John forced himself to travel. He rode from stronghold to stronghold, desperately trying to restore order, but each journey accelerated his collapse. Every stretch of road triggered new intestinal episodes, and his body, already weakened, could not regain strength between attacks. His clothing rarely stayed clean for long, and his attendants grew used to managing his condition several times a day. By this stage the illness had developed a relentless rhythm, urgent intestinal pain, an immediate loss of control, a rapid decline in strength, a short recovery, and then the same cycle again before he could regain balance. By the end of the summer of 1216, it was clear to everyone close to the king that he was no longer fighting only foreign armies or rebellious barons. He was fighting a body that had lost the ability to retain fluid, regulate itself, or maintain the strength needed to function as a ruler. His intestinal failure shaped every moment of his day, disrupted every military decision, and undermined every attempt to project authority. The rebellion did not gain ground solely because of its own force. It advanced because England's king was being emptied, weakened, and worn down faster than he could command his armies to respond. John was entering the final and most destructive stage of the illness that would end both his reign and his life. By the time autumn approached, John's illness no longer came in waves. It had become a constant, unbroken outflow that drained him day and night without pause, pattern, or warning. His attendants no longer waited for him to call. They kept chamber pots beside his bed, near his chair, and within arm's reach of his saddle because the disease offered him no opportunity to prepare. He lived in a state of continuous leakage, with his intestines releasing without his consent at all hours. Sometimes it happened while he slept, sometimes while he spoke, sometimes when he merely shifted his weight. His body had lost the ability to retain anything, and the dehydration carved hollows into his cheeks while fever made his eyes glassy and unfocused. The King of England increasingly resembled a man already halfway departed from the world. Meetings with commanders became almost impossible. John attempted to sit through councils, but within minutes he felt the violent intestinal pressure that meant another uncontrolled evacuation was imminent. The cramps struck so suddenly that he often braced himself against the table, breathing through clenched teeth, but the attack arrived before he could rise. His clothing in the chair beneath him were repeatedly soiled, forcing attendants to intervene immediately. They lifted him carefully, shielded him with cloaks, and hurried him to a screened area where he could be cleaned and redressed, but the heavy odor of sickness filled the room long after his attendants scrubbed the floor. Commanders exchanged dark, worried looks, not because they disdained their king, but because they understood that England's monarch was physically collapsing in front of them while a foreign army advanced. Messages arrived constantly, towns surrendering, barons defecting, French troops tightening their grip on key positions. John attempted to respond, but each effort dissolved under the weight of his illness. When he tried to dictate orders, his hands shook from weakness, his voice quivered, and his focus lasted only until the next intestinal surge overwhelmed him. He would begin explaining troop movements and then falter mid-sentence, gripping the arms of his chair as another uncontrolled evacuation forced him to stop. Attendants supported him under the arms and carried him behind a curtain to change his clothing while the commanders waited in tense silence. When he returned, drained, trembling, and barely coherent, the sour smell of illness clung to him like a shadow he could not escape. Movement became torture. John could no longer ride for more than a short distance before another episode forced him to halt. His legs trembled beneath him from dehydration, his skin burned with fever, his coordination failed him when he tried to mount his horse. Several times he suffered evacuations before attendants could even lift him into the saddle. They placed thick blankets beneath him to absorb what his failing body released, because he no longer had the strength or awareness to manage the illness himself. Every jolt of the horse triggered another intestinal collapse, and by the time he reached a destination, he was so weak that he needed help simply to dismount. Nights were worse. He lay in bedding that had to be replaced repeatedly, shaking from fever and severe dehydration. When cramps seized him, they bent him into a rigid curl, and several evacuations occurred before attendants could position him over the chamber pot. Some attacks were so forceful and rapid that the pot could not be readied in time, leaving the floor and sheets requiring constant removal and scrubbing. His breathing became shallow, his pulse thin, and there were moments when he drifted out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently about fortresses already lost or commands he believed he was giving. The infection had advanced so far into his system that he no longer consistently understood whether he was awake or dreaming. As his physical strength collapsed, so did the kingdom. Rebel barons seized additional fortresses. French forces captured strategic towns. Messages arrived faster than John could comprehend them, and he often confused regions, misdirected orders, or repeated instructions he had given hours earlier. His staff tried desperately to correct the mistakes, but John's mind flickered in and out, weakened by fever, dehydration, and constant intestinal failure. He called for maps he could no longer read, attempted to stand only to lose control again, and struggled to finish even simple directives before the next spasm overtook him. Rumors spread across the realm with frightening speed. Soldiers whispered that the king could not stand without suffering another uncontrolled episode. Barons whispered that he drifted into fevered confusion between sentences. French envoys boasted that England was being held together by a man whose body could no longer hold anything. These were not insults, they were observations. Everyone who came near him left with the same impression: the king was dying in real time, leaking, delirious, exhausted, and slipping away inch by inch while the kingdom crumbled around him. By late October he was barely conscious for more than a few moments at a time. Any food he consumed passed straight through him. Water offered only seconds of relief before another evacuation forced it out. His fever remained high, his breath shallow, and his bowels never stopped releasing. He was deteriorating from within, and with every day of unrelenting intestinal failure, England lost another fortress, another ally, another chance to survive. The monarchy was collapsing at the same pace as the king's body, and both were approaching the point of no return. By the time John began what would become his final march across eastern England, his body was already far past the point of functioning. He no longer walked under his own strength. Attendants lifted and supported him from chamber to chamber, and even this slight movement triggered fresh, uncontrolled intestinal evacuations that soaked through whatever linens they wrapped around him. The infection had stripped away every barrier his intestines once had. A constant, warm leakage escaped from him day and night, sometimes in slow continuous flow, sometimes in abrupt surges, and he no longer distinguished between the two. His body had become a vessel emptying itself without pause. Yet he continued to move because the kingdom demanded motion. Castles surrendered one after another. French banners appeared on horizons that had once belonged to English lords. John insisted on traveling east to rally what remained of his support, but the journey nearly killed him before the war could. When his attendants placed him on a horse, he slumped like a fever-soaked rag, unable to hold his spine upright without two men bracing him. The moment the horse jolted forward, a new intestinal release emptied from him in a steady outflow his body could no longer restrain. His attendants draped thick blankets beneath him and replaced them whenever possible, but the king's condition deteriorated faster than they could manage it. He arrived at Swineshead Abbey barely conscious. Fever had burned through him so thoroughly that he no longer recognized the monks who lifted him from the saddle. They laid him on a straw mattress, but within minutes the bedding had to be stripped and replaced as his bowels continued releasing without interruption. Attendants tried layering cloths beneath him, but each layer soaked through almost immediately. They attempted to position him over chamber pots, but the illness acted faster than their hands could move. Everything he drank passed straight through him before his body had time to absorb it. John drifted in and out of awareness, muttering broken phrases about fortresses he had not seen in months, issuing commands to men who were not present, begging for water only for it to leave his body moments later. His skin grew pale and waxy. His lips cracked. His breathing turned shallow. Each intestinal spasm left him trembling, and the fever's heat radiated from him so intensely that the monks cooled him with damp cloths that quickly had to be discarded. News of the war reached him through voices he could barely follow. Each message was worse than the last: more defections, more lost towns, more advances by the French. When he heard that London had fallen, he tried to sit up, only for a violent spasm to seize him, producing another uncontrollable evacuation that forced attendants to replace the bedding once again. He fell back exhausted, his limbs shaking from dehydration. His urine dwindled to almost nothing. His stool thinned into a near-clear liquid that left him with no salts, no energy, and no strength. His muscles twitched from the depletion. His head grew too heavy for his neck. When the decision came to move him to Newark, he was barely alive. His attendants carried him like a corpse, limp, burning with fever, and constantly leaking through the linens wrapped around him. During the trip he drifted in and out of consciousness while a faint, continuous trail of moisture seeped from him, marking the road behind the group like the path of a dying animal. At each stop the servants cleaned him, changed his clothing, and tried to stabilize him, but the disease outran every effort. His bowels no longer tightened at all. His body released everything the moment it entered him. When he reached Newark Castle, the men carrying him could feel heat radiating from his skin as though a furnace burned inside him. They laid him on a clean bed, and within seconds attendants had to replace the sheets again. The smell of illness filled the chamber instantly, heavy, sour, and impossible to mask. They removed the linens, cleaned him, set new bedding, and within minutes the cycle repeated. His final days became a rhythm of collapse: leak, wipe, replace, repeat, every few minutes, without any sign of improvement. These were not the final moments yet, but everyone in the castle understood that they were close. John lay sinking inward, continuously evacuating, delirious with fever, drained of strength, and barely conscious, while outside the castle walls the kingdom fractured under the pressure of war and foreign occupation. The king was no longer ruling. He was no longer resisting. He was simply dissolving, his body failing faster than anyone could care for it, his life reduced to the shallow breaths he still managed to draw. John's last night began long before the sun set over Newark Castle, because by then he was barely conscious and no longer capable of separating waking from dreaming. Fever had shattered his thoughts into loose fragments, and every breath came with a thin, rattling tremor that warned everyone in the chamber how close the end truly was. His bowels did not pause for a single minute. Even in unconsciousness, his intestines continued releasing in slow, continuous leakage that saturated the bedding and forced attendants to replace linens repeatedly until their arms shook from exhaustion. The infection had destroyed every remaining function inside him. Nothing stayed in his body anymore, everything passed directly out of him in a thin, relentless stream that marked how completely his strength had been stripped away. He drifted between faint awareness and deep delirium. Sometimes his eyes opened halfway, unfocused and shimmering with fever, and he tried to form words, but only warped fragments escaped, part commands, part memories, part misfired thoughts. Then another spasm tightened his abdomen, and another uncontrolled evacuation occurred before his attendants could react. They attempted to lift him toward the chamber pot, but his limbs hung limp, his head rolled sideways, and another episode happened mid-movement. They set him back down gently, preparing new bedding that would require replacement within minutes. The air in the room grew overwhelming. It clung to the walls, seeped into the straw mats, and settled into the clothing and hair of the men tending him. They burned herbs, opened shutters, carried away the waste as fast as they could, but the illness moved faster than their efforts. Each time they cleaned him, another attack followed. Each time they replaced the linens, the fabric became saturated before they had even secured the corners of the mattress. His skin had grown thin and overheated from fever, rubbed raw by the constant wiping, and his thighs were irritated from the never-ending moisture. Even his breath carried a faint sweetness, the unmistakable smell of a body in metabolic collapse. Outside the chamber, England continued to fracture. Messages arrived one after another, each reporting further losses, barons shifting their loyalty to the French, towns refusing to commit soldiers, fortresses negotiating surrender because word of the king's condition had traveled across the realm. Men who had sworn loyalty to him for years now whispered that their ruler was dying, and with him the cause they had once fought to defend. Some believed he was already gone. The truth was worse, he was alive, but his body had deteriorated so completely that his final hours resembled a slow unraveling rather than a dignified death. Late in the night he stirred again, attempting to lift his head, but a violent spasm seized him. His abdomen tightened with such force that for a moment his entire back lifted off the mattress, and a massive, uncontrolled release emptied from him in a single overwhelming surge. It was the last powerful evacuation his failing body could produce. After that, everything weakened. His breathing became shallow. The intestinal leakage continued, but now only in faint, diminishing dribbles, as though even the infection had exhausted the last of what it could drain from him. His eyes opened briefly, dull and unfocused, and his lips moved in an attempt to speak, but no sound followed. Attendants gathered around him, lifting his head slightly to ease his breathing, but he was already slipping away. Sweat cooled on his forehead. His lips dried completely. His limbs trembled faintly, then fell still. The final minutes passed in a strange, heavy quiet, broken only by the soft patter of the last thin leakage escaping his body. And then, with one slow exhale, the king who had once ruled what remained of the Angevin Empire died entirely empty, not by sword, not by poison, not by age, but from the catastrophic failure of his intestines, which had drained him of life faster than his enemies could destroy his kingdom. His attendants cleaned him one last time, lifting a body that was still warm but entirely slack, and a heavy stillness settled over the room. England's king had not fallen in battle. He had not died with ceremony or dignity. He had collapsed into fever, exhaustion, and continuous intestinal failure. His kingdom fractured around him, and his body dissolved beneath him. In the end, John died exactly as he had ruled, desperately trying to hold together something that slipped through his fingers faster than he could grasp it.